November 1st, 866 AD, 4 hours before dawn, on All Saints' Day, and a Northumbrian gateguard, named Wulfric, stands on the eastern wall of York, pressing his frozen fingers against the torch bracket for warmth, his breath forming white clouds in the darkness. And he's thinking about the lamb stew his wife promised to make for the feast day, and wondering if he can convince the watch captain to let him leave an hour early. He doesn't hear them at first. The 3,000 Vikings crouched in the river mist 50 yards beyond the walls. Doesn't hear the soft clink of mail, and the quiet breathing of warriors who've learned to move silent as wolves. Doesn't see the pale-faced commander, being carried forward on a shield by 4 men whose arms tremble not from his weight, but from the honor of bearing a man they believe is touched by the gods themselves. Won't live long enough to finish his shift or taste that lamb stew or kiss his wife goodbye, because in exactly 14 minutes, Ivar the Boneless will give a signal that sounds like a raven's cry, and 3,000 Viking warriors will begin beating their weapons against their shields in rhythm like a giant heartbeat, and Wulfric will turn toward that sound with the torch still in his hand, and his mouth opening to shout a warning he'll never finish giving. And the last thing he'll ever see is an axe blade catching the torchlight as it splits his skull. The sound reaches the city before the warriors do. That rhythmic pounding of metal on wood that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. From the earth itself, a sound that crawls into your chest and makes your heart race and your hands shake and your bladder want to release. The guards along the eastern wall scrambled toward the noise with weapons drawn and fear in their throats. And they see it now, through the lifting mist. Not a wild mob of screaming barbarians, but a wall of shields advancing in perfect formation. Each shield, painted with ravens and serpents, and wolves that seem to writhe and move in the flickering light of dawn. At the center of this advancing nightmare being carried high enough that every man can see him, is Ivar, his body bent at angles that make no sense. His legs twisted beneath him like they're made of rope instead of bone. His face white as fresh snow and beautiful in the way that corpses are beautiful. His eyes, his terrible eyes, one of them milky and dead, but the other burning with intelligence. So fierce it feels like being seen by something that isn't quite human anymore. And the guards want to run, but their feet won't move because they're watching their own death's approach in formation. And there's a horrible fascination in it, like watching a wave rise up before it crashes over your ship. The gates of York are 8 inches of solid oak bound with iron bands that took a blacksmith 3 weeks to forge, and the English defenders throw their shoulders against the massive wooden bar that holds them shut, hands slipping on wood made slick with their own nervous sweat, and they can hear their captain shouting orders that make no sense because the man's voice keeps cracking with fear. Then someone screams, "The east wall." And they turn to see Vikings already pouring over the ramparts at 3 different points. Warriors who climb like spiders despite carrying axes and swords and shields. Men who've been scaling ship rigging in North Sea storms since they were children and who treat a 15-foot stone wall like it's nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The first Viking over the eastern wall is a warrior named Bjorn Ironsides, no relation to Ivar's brother of the same name. And he drops onto the wooden walkway behind the gates with his knees bent and his axe already swinging, and 2 English guards die before they can even turn around, their blood spraying across ancient Roman stones that have seen centuries of violence, but nothing quite like this. Within seconds, 20 more Vikings are over the wall and the gates are being opened from the inside. The massive wooden bar lifted and thrown aside, and now the shield wall pours through the opening like a flood of iron and fury, and screaming faces, and there's no stopping them because this isn't a raid for silver and slaves. This is conquest. This is the beginning of something that will reshape England forever. Ivar is carried into the city on his shield, directing the assault with hand signals and barked commands in Norse that his warriors obey instantly without question. And you can see the tactical genius in every decision he makes. The way he sends one group to secure the grain stores, while another takes the bridge and a third surrounds the noble quarter where the wealthy merchants live. The English defenders are brave, some of them incredibly brave, men who stand their ground and fight to the last breath, even when they know it's hopeless. But they're confused and disorganized and caught completely off guard because they thought the Vikings had gone south for the winter. They had no idea that Ivar had been planning this assault for months, waiting for this exact moment when York's two rival kings were fighting each other instead of preparing for invasion. The streets of York become a maze of violence and smoke and screaming as Viking warriors pour through the city, like wolves through a sheepfold, kicking down doors and dragging families into the streets. And the smell of burning thatch mixes with blood and fierce sweat and wood smoke, until the air itself becomes thick and choking. But Ivar has given strict orders about what to burn and what to preserve, about who to kill and who to capture, because unlike most Viking leaders who think only of plunder and glory, Ivar is thinking 5 moves ahead, thinking about how to rule this city, not destroy it, how to make it the capital of a Viking kingdom that will last for generations. The Northumbrian nobles who've been sleeping in their warm beds are dragged into the streets in their nightclothes, some in silk that's now torn and blood-stained, some barefoot on cold cobblestones, and they're brought before this twisted man on a shield who questions them in surprisingly good English about tax collection and food stores, and which local lords might be convinced to switch sides. The nobles are terrified, not just because they're prisoners of Vikings, but because this pale commander with the dead eye and the broken body seems to understand statecraft and governance better than their own kings do, asks questions that reveal he's been studying their kingdom for months, knows their weaknesses and their debts and their secret alliances, and they realize with growing horror that they're not dealing with a barbarian raider, but with something far more dangerous, a military genius who reads people the way other men read runes. By midday on November 1st, 866, York belongs to the Vikings. The English banners have been torn down and replaced with Norse raven standards that snap in the wind from the river Ouse, and Ivar the Boneless, a man who cannot stand on his own legs, has conquered the most important city in northern England with a combination of military brilliance and ruthless efficiency that will make him a legend sung about in mead halls for the next 1,000 years. But to understand how this moment came to be, to understand why this particular Viking commander is leading this particular army into this particular city, you have to go back 3 years and across the North Sea to a moment of horror that set all of this in motion, to an old man drowning in serpent venom while his sons sharpen their weapons and swear oaths that will drench England in blood. Ragnar Lothbrok, if the sagas are to be believed, and historians argue endlessly about this, was the most famous Viking of his age, a warrior who'd raided Paris and sailed to the Mediterranean and fathered sons who would become kings and legends. But in 865 AD, he made a fatal miscalculation that would change the course of English history. He sailed to England with only 2 ships, instead of a proper fleet, perhaps because he was old and wanted one last adventure, perhaps because he'd grown arrogant after so many successful raids, perhaps because the gods had decided his time was up, and when a storm wrecked his ships off the Northumbrian coast, he and his surviving men were captured by King Glass forces and dragged in chains to York. King Glass, who ruled from this same city that his enemies would conquer 3 years later, had a reputation for excessive cruelty even by the brutal standards of the 9th century, a man who enjoyed watching people suffer, who saw torture as entertainment, and when he realized he'd captured the famous Ragnar Lothbrok, he wanted to make a spectacle of it, wanted all of Northumbria to see what happened to Vikings who dared raid English shores. He had a pit dug in the courtyard of his palace and filled it with vipers and adders and every venomous serpent his men could catch, dozens of them writhing and hissing in the darkness. And then he had Ragnar stripped of his armor and thrown into that pit, while the Northumbrian nobles watched and laughed and placed bets on how long the old Viking would survive. According to the sagas, Ragnar didn't scream or beg or curse. Instead, he sang a death song about his life and his victories and his sons, and the last words he spoke before the venom stopped his heart were how the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. And the Northumbrian nobles thought he was delirious from the poison, didn't understand that he was prophesying their doom, that the little pigs were his sons and they would grunt by bringing an army to England that would make the English wish they'd never heard the name Lothbrok. When news of Ragnar's death reached Denmark, carried by a surviving crew member who'd escaped and sailed home, Ivar understood his father's final words immediately, and he gathered his brothers Halfdan and Uber, and together they began assembling what the English chronicles would call the Great Heathen Army. And that name wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. It was the terrified truth. This wasn't a raiding party of a few hundred men in a handful of ships. This was a proper invasion force of thousands of warriors from Denmark and Norway and Sweden. Professional soldiers who'd been fighting since they were teenagers. Men who'd seen their share of blood and treasure, and knew that England was ripe for conquest, because the English kingdoms spent more time fighting each other than preparing for foreign invasion. The army that landed in East Anglia in the autumn of 865 was like nothing England had ever seen. Disciplined and well supplied and led by commanders who'd studied Roman military tactics from captured books and adapted them to Viking fighting styles. And Ivar was the strategist, the brain behind every campaign, the one who planned where to attack and when to make peace and how to play the English kingdoms against each other like pieces on a game board. The English at this time weren't a unified nation but a collection of rival kingdoms constantly at war with each other. Northumbria in the north ruled by two kings who hated each other. Mercia, in the Midlands, wealthy but militarily weak. East Anglia, in the east Christian and peaceful. Wessex in the south, just beginning to rise under a young prince named Alfred. And Ivar saw these divisions the way a wolf sees a flock of scattered sheep, opportunities waiting to be exploited. The great Heathen Army spent the winter of 865 to 866 in East Anglia, and King Edmund of East Anglia, a young and deeply Christian king, barely 20 years old, who would later be made a saint, made what he thought was a pragmatic deal with the Vikings. He would give them horses and supplies in exchange for peace. And Ivar agreed immediately, because horses were exactly what his army needed. Vikings were famous as sailors and warriors, but they were also excellent cavalry fighters once they had mounts. And with Edmund's horses, the great heathen army became mobile in a way that terrified the English, able to strike anywhere in the kingdom within days instead of weeks, moving faster than messengers could carry warnings, appearing outside city walls before defenders even knew they were coming. In the autumn of 806, Ivar led his newly mounted army north toward York, knowing from his scouts and spies that Northumbria was in chaos because Kings Osbert and Gli were fighting a civil war for control of the kingdom, their armies killing each other while the real threat approached from the south, and Glar was the man who'd killed his father, the man Ivar had sworn to destroy in the most terrible way imaginable. And now he was bringing an army to the walls of Glass capital city on the morning of a Christian holy day when the defenders would be tired and distracted. And that brings us back to November 1st, 2, Wulfric on the wall, and the shield wall emerging from the mist, and the gates being forced open, and Vikings pouring through the streets. To Ivar, being carried on his shield through conquered streets, giving orders in 2 languages, building an empire from a position that should have been weakness, but through sheer force of will and intelligence became the foundation of something that would last a century. The English kingdoms finally understood the magnitude of the threat and tried to respond, but it was too late. Ivar had turned York into a fortress, repairing the ancient Roman walls, stockpiling food and weapons, training his warriors in urban combat. And when Kings Osbert and Gley finally put aside their differences and assembled a combined army to retake their capital city in the spring of 860, they found the Vikings ready and waiting behind walls that had stood for 8 centuries and would stand for 8 more. The Battle of York on March 21, 867, was a catastrophe for the English, a disaster so complete that it broke Northumbrian power forever. And it started with what looked like a Viking mistake, the defenders attacking the city walls at dawn, and the Vikings seeming to panic and fall back in disarray. And the English thought they were winning, thought the Vikings were retreating, and they pressed forward with growing confidence, exhausting themselves with assault after assault against the walls. And then, at midday, when the English army was tired and disorganized and spread thin around the city perimeter, the gates suddenly flew open, and 3,000 Vikings poured out in a tight shield wall formation that cut through the exhausted English forces like an axe through rotten wood. And the English line broke, and men ran in every direction, and the Vikings hunted them through the streets of York like wolves running down deer. King Osbert died with honor, fighting to the last with his bodyguards around him, going down under a dozen Viking spears but taking 3 warriors with him. But King Glar, the man who'd killed Ragnar Gley tried to run, and was caught by Vikings who'd been specifically ordered to take him alive, and they dragged him through the streets to where Ivar waited. And what happened next has been debated and argued about for over 1,000 years. The sagas say that Ivar had Gley killed by the blood eagle, a ritual execution so horrifying that modern historians question whether it was even physically possible, where the victim's back is cut open and the ribs are severed from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings while the victim is still alive, still conscious, still able to scream. The sagas say that Gley was held down by 4 warriors while a Norse priest performed the ritual with a blade heated until it glowed red. That Gley screamed curses at Ivar, who watched with cold satisfaction and never said a word. That it took hours for Jor to die. That birds came and landed on his outstretched ribs thinking they were branches. And that Ivar finally spoke only after Gley had gone silent, saying the little pig has finally stopped grunting. Modern historians question all of this, argue that the blood eagle might have been a misunderstanding of Norse poetry, that it was propaganda added by later writers to make Vikings seem more savage, that Gley probably just had his back cut open after death in a symbolic gesture. But what's absolutely certain is that Gley died in Viking captivity, and his death sent a message across England that couldn't be misunderstood. The Northmen were not raiders who could be bought off or frightened away. They were conquerors who demanded absolute submission or total annihilation. With Northumbria under Viking control, and both its kings dead, Ivar turned his attention south, and over the next 2 years, the great Heathen Army cut through England with methodical efficiency, taking the Mercian capital of Nottingham in 8, forcing the Mercian king to pay tribute and accept Viking overlordship, conquering one kingdom after another while Ivar pulled the strings from York like a spider at the center of a web. But there was one English king who refused to submit, who refused to pay tribute or acknowledge Viking authority, who believed that compromise with pagans was a sin worse than death. And his name was Edmund, the same young king who'd given Ivar horses back in 8. And Edmund had spent 4 years watching Vikings destroy his fellow Christians, watching them burn churches and kill priests and turn monasteries into stables. He couldn't live with the decision he'd made. Couldn't live with the knowledge that he'd helped the pagans conquer England by giving them the mobility they needed. And so, in 869, when Ivar sent messengers demanding that Edmund submit to Viking authority and convert to the Norse faith, Edmund refused, and Ivar brought his army south to East Anglia to make an example that all England would remember and fear. The Vikings caught Edmund's army near a place called Hoxne in Suffolk in November of 869. And the battle was short and brutal and one side. The East Anglians fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by warriors who'd been conquering England for 4 years. And when it became clear the battle was lost, Edmund's bodyguards begged him to flee, to escape into the forests and fight another day. But Edmund refused. He believed that a Christian king had a duty to suffer alongside his people, to choose martyrdom over survival, if that's what God demanded, to prove his faith by dying rather than by living. And so when the Vikings surrounded him with arrows drawn and axes raised, Edmund stood his ground with his sword planted in the earth and his hands folded in prayer. What happened next depends on which source you believe, and both versions have been told and retold for 11 centuries, and the truth is probably lost somewhere in the fog of war and time and propaganda. The Christian accounts say that Ivar demanded Edmund renounce Christ and worship the Norse gods, and when Edmund refused, they tied him to a tree and used him for archery practice, shooting arrow after arrow into his body while he prayed aloud until finally someone stepped forward with an axe and ended his suffering. The Norse sagas tell a completely different story. They say Edmund challenged Ivar to single combat despite being exhausted from battle, that they fought for an hour with Edmund, showing unexpected skill until Ivar finally landed a killing blow. That Ivar respected his courage even while ending his life and had him buried with honor rather than left for the crows. Whatever the truth, and we'll never know for certain which version is accurate, or if both are lies and the truth is something else entirely. Edmund's death marked the end of East Anglian independence and transformed him into a Christian martyr whose cult would spread across England. His body eventually buried at a monastery that would become the great abbey of Bury St Edmunds, where miracles were reported and kings would come to pray. And with Edmund dead and East Anglia conquered, Only one English kingdom remained free, the southern kingdom of Wessex, ruled by a young king named Alfred, who would spend the next decade fighting Vikings and who would one day be the only English king called the Great. But that's a different story, because this story is about Ivar, and Ivar's story is entering its final chapter. Ivar the Boneless ruled his conquered territories from York for the next 3 years, and he revealed himself to be not just a military genius, but also a surprisingly effective administrator. And this is what separated him from every other Viking leader of his time. He understood that conquest was only the beginning and that the real challenge was building something that would last after the swords were sheathed and the warriors went home. He kept many English nobles in their positions of power as long as they swore loyalty to him and paid their taxes, maintained English laws and customs while adding Norse traditions, encouraged marriages between Vikings and English families, promoted trade between the conquered territories and Scandinavia, built a hybrid culture that blended Norse and Anglo-Saxon elements in ways that would shape northern England for centuries and create something entirely new. The city of York became Shorvik under his rule, a thriving Viking capital where Norse and English languages mixed together and created new words and phrases, where pagan temples stood alongside Christian churches and both faiths were tolerated as long as they didn't cause trouble, where English farmers sold their crops to Viking merchants and their children played together in streets that had seen conquest but were now seeing something stranger and more lasting, an actual fusion of two cultures. This was Ivar's true genius and his real legacy. He understood that you couldn't rule a conquered people through terror alone, that eventually the terror wears off and you're left trying to govern people who hate you and will rebel the moment you show weakness. So you needed to give them reasons to accept your rule, to see you as a king rather than just a warlord, to make them participants in the new order rather than just victims of it. Under his administration, the former kingdom of Northumbria became the core of what historians would call the Danelaw, the region of England where Danish law and customs prevailed and Vikings settled as permanent residents rather than just raiders passing through, where English and Norse lived side by side and gradually became something new. Neither fully English, nor fully Norse, but a blend of both. But Ivar's health, never good even by the standards of a man called the Boneless, which suggests he had some condition that affected his bones or joints or mobility, was failing rapidly by 872. And unlike his father Ragnar, who'd gone seeking one last adventure in his old age, Ivar prepared carefully for his succession because he'd spent 7 years building something, and he wasn't about to let it collapse into civil war the moment he died. He divided his territories between his brothers Halfdan and Ubba, made sure they understood how to maintain the delicate balance between Viking overlordship and English cooperation, extracted oaths of loyalty from every important noble and warlord, ensured that the transition of power would be smooth and that his kingdom would survive him. The sagas say that Ivar died in bed surrounded by his brothers and his most trusted warriors, a rare fate for a Viking warlord. Most of them died in battle, or were murdered by rivals, or went down with their ships in storms. But Ivar had time to see death coming, and time to prepare for it, and time to give final instructions. His last words, according to sources that may or may not be reliable, were advice to his brothers about how to rule the English, to be firm but fair, to respect their Christian traditions while maintaining Norse identity, to remember that they were building something that would outlast any single raiding season or battle, to think not just about conquest, but about legacy. And then Ivar, the Boneless, the man who'd conquered England without ever being able to stand on his own 2 feet, who'd avenged his father in the most terrible way imaginable, and built a kingdom, and changed the course of history, closed his eyes for the last time, somewhere around the age of 40, having accomplished more from a shield-carried throne than most kings accomplish from their palace chairs, leaving behind a legacy that would outlast empires. The Vikings buried Ivar somewhere in England, the location lost to history despite numerous attempts by archaeologists to find his grave, and the great heathen army he'd led continued its campaigns under Halfdan and Ubba. But the kingdom he'd built survived and thrived. The Danelaw lasted for generations, and York remained a Viking city until 954, nearly a century after Ivar first stormed its gates on that foggy November morning. The Viking conquest of northern England changed the English language forever. adding thousands of Norse words that we still use today without realizing their origin. Words like sky and knife, and take, and get, and they and them, and window, and husband, and hundreds of others, changed English law with Norse concepts of jury trials and property rights that we still use today. Changed English culture with Norse attitudes about women's rights and trade and exploration that were more progressive than the Anglo-Saxon traditions they replaced. And, most importantly, the Viking invasion forced the surviving English kingdoms to unite under Alfred the Great and his successors, to put aside their petty rivalries and feuds and work together for survival, creating the unified English nation that would eventually emerge from the chaos of the 9th century stronger and more cohesive than the fractured collection of warring kingdoms that existed before. Ivar the Boneless remains one of history's most enigmatic figures, a man whose very nickname sparks endless debate among scholars who can't agree on what it means. Was he actually disabled with some form of osteogenesis imperfecta, or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that made his bones fragile and his joints high? Or was boneless a metaphor for his flexibility in battle, or his ability to slip through enemy defenses like water through fingers? We'll probably never know for certain, because the historical records from 9th century England are fragmentary and contradictory, and often written generations after the events by Christian monks who had every reason to demonize pagan invaders and turn them into monsters rather than complex human beings. What we do know for absolute certain, confirmed by English and Norse sources alike, is that Ivar was real, that he led the great Heathen Army that conquered most of England between 865 and 870, that he took York in 866 and built a Viking kingdom from that city that lasted for nearly a century, that he was remembered by both Vikings and English as a commander of exceptional intelligence and ruthlessness who changed the face of England forever. And that November morning when he stormed the gates of York, carried on a shield by his warriors, marked the beginning of a new chapter in English history, the moment when England stopped being a collection of warring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and began the painful process of becoming a unified nation forged in the fire of Viking invasion. Though Ivar himself has been dead for over 1100 years, his legacy lives on in the English language we speak, in the laws we follow, in the cultural attitudes we inherit without knowing where they came from, in the very idea of England itself as a unified nation rather than a collection of tribes, because sometimes the most powerful warriors aren't the ones who can stand tallest, but the ones who can think furthest ahead, who can turn conquest into kingdom and revenge into legacy, who can change the world from a position that should have been weakness, but through sheer force of will and intelligence became the foundation of something that would outlast empires and echo through the centuries until the end of time.